I'm curious if you were in the position of being a clinician working with one of these athletes. Let's say you've laid out the game plan in terms of what rehab's going to look like, and they've done well. You've been measuring these sort of metrics throughout the process, and they've met these sort of return to play criteria that are based on the studies that we have at the moment. And they say, all right, so I'm good to go now, right? I don't have to worry about it. We know that fear of re-injury is a pretty big predictor of re-injury. So what do you think might be a reasonable thing to say to that young athlete in that situation?
Yeah, I'm glad that you bring up fear of re-injury, or kind of these psychological kind of readiness constructs. These are really important, we know from the literature, as they relate to return to sport success. But there is also some early evidence starting to show that they also are related to second injury. And so, I think we don't fully understand right now how psychological factors, whether they be fear or confidence, are those similar? Are those different? How do those relate to risk of injury or success? They may have opposite effects. So I think we don't really know this, but my intuition is that there may be some healthy level. I don't want to say healthy level of fear, but in patients that are very confident, but maybe aren't physically ready or biologically ready from a healing and recovery standpoint, may be at risk, just like maybe those who are highly fearful but right. return. And maybe these are working by different mechanisms that we don't really understand right now. Sure. But we definitely know that that psychological factors play a big role in this process, no doubt. And that isn't something that we measured in this study that we tested, at least at the onset of the study. So I think it's a really good discussion to have.
Well, as you brought up the healthy level of fear that we might otherwise name in a minute, I think that makes sense, and it brings to mind that sort of U-shaped curve of estimation of one's ability versus actual ability, and how if we overestimate our ability compared to what we can actually do, then performance usually ends up suffering, versus if we underestimate what we can do, then also we have poor performance. So that sort of ideal place to be is somewhere in the middle, where we're more or less in tune with what we can actually do. And just thinking back to a couple of cases of patients that I've worked with who have had an ACL reconstruction, we've kind of worked through that process, and it depended a little bit on their inherent disposition. One of the people that comes to mind was inherently really cautious and a little bit fearful. So I was trying to pump him up a little bit, but still affirm that, hey, this caution is good. It's helpful for us, especially as we get you back into doing these activities, these sports, because we haven't tried them out yet. And that prevented him from, he played ultimate Frisbee, and he would not put himself in situations where he'd have to really work hard to get after a pass or be battling somebody else for position, until he had a number of games and a bunch of hours of experience under his belt. And we had been able to kind of field test the stuff that we've been working hard on in the clinic. And as that happened, then he was able to kind of open himself up a little bit more and not worry so much, because we knew what he could do, or at least more of what he could do.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great point. It really kind of brings up this idea of return to sport being on a continuum. So it isn't a one point in time thing or a decision that, toward end stage rehab, there should be incorporation of sport specific activities, and even some level of sports participation, which then transitions into return to sport. But there still is a big gap between return to sport and return to performance too, that I think is challenging to evaluate as a clinician sometimes. But I think it's a big part of this puzzle. And so you're basically alluding to, in incorporating training and exposure to these activities that, makes these athletes better able to adapt in, do what they need to do in their sport in a very unpredictable environment. which is very different than what typical rehab looks like for these patients, which is very, kind of closed environment and
discrete tasks,
predictable and exactly. And participating in sports is almost always the opposite of that. And so I think figuring out ways that can be incorporated in late stage rehab and throughout that transition is really important.